You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where we read the Bible and take it seriously.
Most of the time.
Seriously enough to take it seriously. Oh, we take the Bible seriously. We don't take ourselves so much seriously.
Oh, we've never been guilty of that.
Well,
there might have been a brief moment like in the later teens,
that's what I was
early
thinking,
20s.
Like everyone, I think, takes themselves a little too seriously in their late teens, mid to late teen years. But, yeah.
We don't want to go
over
down
that business.
Yeah. We don't want to return to those years. Yeah. If you knew us during that time, forgive us. We've changed.
So, anyway, but that's enough about that, I suppose.
If you want to know more stories about that, contact us directly.
Yeah. Anyway, so that being said, we are back in the Bible. We should get back to the Bible.
Yeah, we're still in 2 Samuel. We're in chapter 6. Uzzah has just died, and David is scared to bring the ark home.
Yeah, so we should. Yeah, that's where we left, and that's what we should talk about, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's why people are here. But you know, he is.
So,
go ahead.
I think we should do a quick recap,
Okay.
though. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah, they happen to remember they left the ark and what?
Wherever.
They left the ark presumably in someone's garage or garage equivalent.
We hadn't got to that point yet.
And they remembered that it was there.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They went to get it, and they, instead of contacting the priest about it and getting the right stuff going on, they contacted the military leaders, and the military leaders decided to do things the complete wrong way, if you can believe that.
The most efficient way.
The most efficient way, what presumably would be the most efficient. The oxen stumbled. What I think is interesting, the oxen stumbled. Mm-hmm. There was no indication that the ark started to fall.
Right.
And then Uzzah stuck his hand out and touched the ark, and then he died.
Yeah, and the rabbis make a very big point that it is that God caused the oxen to stumble to make this point, to teach Israel this lesson. And so it wasn't just, the oxen stumbled. It was, no, God's like, I've had enough of this, and we're going to put an end to this right now.
Okay.
And so, there's a lot of really interesting stories, and I didn't even go into like half of them about this whole incident because I think, like me, this is a story that's bugged a lot of people and trying to figure out how to make sense of it. And that's why I was talking last week about you've got to go back to 1 Samuel 4. You've got to go back and look at when the Philistines took the ark and what God was teaching them in that moment. Right. And not just the Philistines, but also the nation of Israel and what it meant to have the ark as a symbol of God's presence. And more than a symbol, that God actually made himself known above the ark. And I think sometimes we've got too many Hollywood images. We've got too many, just the things in the Old Testament, we don't always think about how real they were for the person in the moment.
Yeah.
And and that's one of the things I do love about the way that Judaism remembers these events is that you're supposed to actually stop and when you celebrate a holiday like Passover, that you would actually stop and try to imagine yourself there. And so it's thought of as joining yourself to that moment, to the people in those moments. It's not just this happened once upon a time. This is a real event that shaped my life and why I am where I am today,
right? Even
in the year we are. So, this story, there's not a holiday for it, but at the same time, I think it's so shocking that people do go, wait a minute, if that had been me, I would have been the person to try to stop the ark from falling.
Yeah.
And so
definitely, I mean, it makes sense to try to stop the ark from falling. I mean, if you're assuming it's about to fall,
well,
especially when it's a sacred object,
right?
I mean, how many times have we dropped things and tried to catch them?
Like children. You don't try to catch your children?
Well, no, I do. I'm trying to think if I've ever dropped my kid. I don't think I have, but that's irrelevant. I could be wrong. A lot's happened, and
You got dropped one time.
I got dropped one time. Yeah, but I mean, a lot's happened in the last 7 years, and most of it with less sleep than typical.
Well, that's part of being a parent.
Yes, so
So, but this story, one of the things it's teaching the nation is you have to do what God tells you to do in the manner he tells you to do it, and you need to respect him. And that's really what the point of the story. And plus, I think it's also teaching David a little bit of humility because
mhm,
he's just come off the back of these major successes. And he's done so well. He's king over all of Israel. He has conquered Jerusalem. He's defeated the Philistines. He's flying high.
mhm, mhm,
And, he'd also had some events where in the past where like when he ate the showbread, God seemed to let him get by with, breaking the rules.
right.
So, how does David view himself? And does he need to be brought back in line and understand that he better be just as willing to show God the respect he's due as anybody else?
Mhm,
And David seems to get it because he understands at this point he is looking at an object and a God that is dangerous, and God is always dangerous, and I think we tend to forget that too. So, I'm finding that I found the story disturbing before, but now I kinda love it. So but we'll pick up in verse 10, and it says, "So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite." Now, like I said, David's realized that the ark is too dangerous to bring into Jerusalem, and he knows that if he tries it, he could probably hurt more people than he can help,
so now we're going to store it in someone else's house.
right? Because it had been at Abinadab's house before this, after the Philistines had returned it, and the people and David are now being confronted with a God who will not tolerate people who are failing to be who they were called to be.
Mhm,
These are the people who were set aside to worship God and to worship God properly. And so now we are being told, hey, God's going to require that his nation uphold the standards that he gave them.
yep.
That's part of being an Israelite, is being that nation that's set apart, that's holy, and they have to rise to the occasion. Now, David takes the ark to the home of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The name is easy to parse because Obed is servant, Edom is red. So the traditional reading of this is that this is a servant who shamed a king. He caused the king's face to turn red
Hmm.
in embarrassment because
Which king?
David specifically,
Okay.
because he was able to take the ark into his house and nobody dies.
And David wasn't.
Exactly. But we do have a problem because he's a Gittite, and a Gittite is just somebody who's from Gath. Well, who's from Gath? Goliath and his brothers. So this was a Philistine city. This is a city that was inhabited by giants. And now we've got this Gittite who it has the ark in their home. So we have to come up with a solution for this. How do we reconcile all of that?
Well, didn't we talk about just because you live in a place doesn't mean you're a descendant?
That is absolutely one possible option. Another is he's one of the 600 Gittites who followed David. We're going to learn about them in 2 Samuel 15.
Okay.
So we've got some time to get there. But this would mean that he actually was a Philistine, which is an interesting idea, that David had Philistines who were faithful to him.
Again, dispensing with the idea that there wasn't only 20 people who, God saved before Jesus came.
Right, right.
I say 20 is a random number. It just seems like there's
20 foreigners that God said, oh, yeah, you're good enough.
Well, no, I'm just saying total. There seems to be this implication that only the people specifically mentioned in the Bible, everyone else just got written off as
Exactly, exactly. And
the cost of the system or something.
it's amazing how many times you do find these foreigners kind of folded into the Israelite nation.
Well, and it's amazing how it's just kind of casually mentioned in the Bible, in
No
the
big
Old
deal.
Testament, and like it really is the modern, the popular like reading of the Bible that we grew up with, and a lot of our friends grew up with, especially in like more fundamentalist camps, is that only Israel ever had any hope of being saved, and
Mhm.
only the Israelites who managed to do, all of the law, because according to the misreading of the Bible,
Right.
And I know we mention this and we harp on it a lot, but it's really important to hear it. I mean, because every episode might be someone's first,
Right.
but it's really important to hear that the covenant was not a quote covenant of works
Right.
like we want to talk about. And pardon me, I'll turn the do not disturb on in just a minute. I just got a notification, but it's this idea that only the people of Israel had any hope of being
Mhm.
saved, and that's we overread certain things.
Well, we don't understand election. We have failed to understand that in the Old Testament, very much it's the election to service, and their job as a nation was not to be so set apart that they were the only ones who had a relationship with God. It was they were set apart to draw other people to
Uh-huh.
have this
Uh-huh.
relationship with God.
Well, and I think election to service is not just an Old Testament concept either.
I
I
agree.
mean, I think we see that with Paul,
Hmm.
and I mean, again, we're gonna lose some friends and alienate some people here, but I think God decided with Paul,
Hmm.
Paul's going to be responsible for spreading the gospel.
Uh-huh.
And I think he started being responsible for spreading the gospel by persecuting Christians because he was driving them out of Jerusalem
Well, this is a
in
good
order for
point,
the gospel to spread.
right?
And you have Paul's life as this microcosm of what he's writing about in Romans,
Hmm.
saying, hey, if someone rejecting the truth is responsible for this much of the truth getting spread, how much more with someone, Paul, for
Right.
example, accepting the truth can spread the gospel even farther. So, it's you look at it, and I think it's God was going to use Paul whether he surrendered to Jesus on the Damascus Road
Oh,
or
absolutely.
not. Now, I think it was you've mentioned before. Paul had already made up his mind.
He was looking for God.
He believed he was looking for God, and when
Mhm.
Jesus came and corrected him,
Uh-huh.
I don't believe that was an irresistible act. I think Paul could, and again, making
Right.
a lot of people mad right now. I think Paul could have said no.
Right.
And I think at that point, it would have been sealed for him if he had said no, that he was never making it in, but God still would have used whatever actions, just like he used Pharaoh,
Hmm.
to carry out his plan.
Oh,
So,
we can look at a
it's-
number of people, and matter of fact, one of the traditional readings of Balaam is that he would have been the most effective prophet to the nations
Mhm.
had he ever fully surrendered to God.
Yeah.
And so, he still has the gift of prophecy. He still is able to use it. It's never taken away from him
Mhm.
in his lifetime. Now, does he use it correctly? Only when God pushes him into a corner,
Right.
but it still accomplishes the purposes that God had laid out for him. And so, yeah, and that's the thing with Israel. They are never, um, they don't get it right. Election didn't mean they were perfect. It
Right.
doesn't mean that they were able to specifically. I mean, look at the story we're reading. They're
Yeah.
making a mess of things.
Well, and you can't deny that David was elected by God to be king.
Exactly. Exactly.
And he obviously screws up so much stuff, and that's the story we're getting into.
Precisely.
So, I mean, and Saul and Samson and who else? I mean,
I-
the list goes on. Abraham.
Yeah, and there's no perfect role model in the Old Testament,
Right.
but that's the point. And everybody, oh well, look, you worship this God who has all these followers who are so messed up. That's the point.
Mhm, mhm,
If he can redeem these guys, he can redeem you.
mhm.
And so no one's hopeless. And now we've got these 600 Gittites and Philistines that are following David, and they're part of his army, and they help promote and protect and
Mhm.
expand the kingdom of God. And they're not part of quote unquote the elect. And so that's an interesting point
Yep.
when you put it back in context. Now, the other option for these Gittites is or this particular Gittite, Obed Edom, is he is a Levite because there's several Obed Edoms in the Bible.
Okay.
So trying to figure out which one is which and where they overlap is problematic. So in First Chronicles 15, we have one named who is a musician and a doorkeeper, but he's not referred to as a Gittite. We know he's one of the Levites.
Okay.
So that would go along with, he lived there, but he wasn't necessarily a descendant from that place. And so again, if you take that view, then the Levite and the Gittite don't have any connection. You have to break that connection because the
Mhm.
Levite wouldn't live in the city of Gath.
Right.
So it's not clear in scripture. We just don't have any kind of clear cut explanation, and you can see that the explanations we can offer are kind of all over the place. Now, option 2 is the most popular, that he is a Levite, but then why is he identified as a Gittite? And so that's a really interesting thing because it does make sense. Abinadab was a Levite. And so he would have known how to take care of the ark. And so it makes sense that you would think if you leave the ark someplace else again, that you would leave it with another Levite. The idea that he's an Israelite who lives uh, in Gath and was possibly had no connection to the Levites is kind of a meh for me. I mean, it's not impossible. It could have happened. Um, David and his men had been living in the Philistine country, and until quite recently, they hadn't been able to move back. So the fact that at this point the Philistines who had followed him kind of moved back, it works. But I don't really see anything theologically compelling about either of those two um, options, and I like the one that has the most room for asking theological questions.
Okay.
And option 1, that this is one of the 600 Philistines, it gives us the most to think about. Now, it's not, I don't think we can completely prove it, and I'm not claiming that it's completely correct.
Mhm.
But if you remember back to the opening of First Samuel, the 4 through 6, where the Philistines did take the ark, then this idea of what it would mean for the king of Israel to surrender the ark to a Philistine at this point for protecting his people, it would really speak to the level of fear that David has experienced.
Mhm.
And you got to remember that when the Philistines brought the ark back, and they had cows who had nursing calves who
Mhm.
had not been yoked before, and they put it on the cart, and they're doing their best to honor the ark according to their customs. God didn't strike them dead. God allowed them to carry through their purposes because it's all they knew to do.
Sure. Sure.
And so they're doing the best they know how to do. Now, once the ark gets back to Bet Shemesh, then that's when God strikes the Israelites dead because they didn't say, okay, these guys have it wrong.
Mhm.
It's back in our care. We need to correct this. And so it really it makes for some interesting thoughts about who the Philistines were and what David was thinking at this point in time. And I'll note that Zamora actually leads towards this reading, so I'm not alone.
Okay.
I just don't know if either of us would ever be able to prove it completely,
Sure.
because Zamora believes that this is one of the Philistines that joined David when he's in Ziklag, and if he had been a Philistine who had been with David in Ziklag and had fought alongside David for all of these years, then David wouldn't have a problem trusting him with the national treasure. And so it kind of enlarges that message that God really isn't a respecter of persons. God is looking for the persons whose heart is pure and whose
Mhm.
motivation is pure. And so even as God would punish anyone, as a Philistine for messing up, he's going to punish Israelites for messing up, but he's also going to bless a Philistine who tries to get it right and shows God the proper honor. And I think we forget that, you know, there is provision. Even in the Torah, there's provision for sins someone commits in ignorance,
Mhm.
because we learn as we go along, and God understands that, and He lets us learn. Now, once we know something, we're responsible for it. And the nation of Israel should have understood how to treat this sacred object.
Right.
So, verse 11, and the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed Edom and all his household. So 3 months is a interesting time frame. Judah was informed Tamar was pregnant after the 3 months after their encounter, and that's in Genesis 38:24. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for 3 months. And there's this idea that 3 months and childbirth is they're very connected within the biblical society. I mean, because this is the point where it's starting to get hard to hide that you're pregnant. This is when people
Hmm.
start to understand and realize, hey, my neighbor's pregnant, my friend's pregnant, and there's no denying it. And this is exactly what the rabbis read into the story, because when they say that Edom's house was blessed, they're saying he was blessed with increased fertility. And it was a season of blessing that was needed actually to birth a new theology within the nation of Israel, because at this point the only contact and the main thing that the people who are living at this point know about the ark is it's dangerous.
Hmm.
They probably know the story of what happened when it was captured by the Philistines. They probably know the story of what happened at Bet Shemesh. They know that Uzzah's died. So now they have to see that not only can someone survive with the ark in their midst, that blessing can actually come out of having the ark in your house. And it's that balance of rejoicing with trembling, because, is God dangerous? Absolutely. But you have to balance that against his desire to bless and his love for humanity. And it's the two pieces together that give you the whole picture. If you just look at God's justice and his wrath and his holiness, then you're never going to be able to appreciate his love and his kindness, his grace and his mercy. But if these are the things that you're looking at, those are the only things you're looking at, then you might be tempted to think that God isn't a God of justice and a God of wrath. So you've got to hold those two things in tension. Excuse me. And what better picture than a Philistine that takes the ark into his house, being blessed by a
Hmm.
God
Hmm.
who is a God that he didn't owe any allegiance to.
Right.
And all of a sudden, he's doing the right thing, and God says, I'm gonna bless you. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
And I think we forget that God is all about turning our presuppositions and our preconceived ideas on their head. And he does this by revealing his character.
Right.
Almost every time you have somebody whose theology is blown apart, it's because they've grasped something new about God's character.
Hmm.
So, yeah, if you were just reading through Chronicles, there would be a break between verse 11 and 12. And we've already looked at those verses because they're parallel to 1 Samuel 5, the previous chapter.
Okay.
So this is in Chronicles, this is where the writer adds in about David's wives and children, about defeating Jerusalem, about defeating the Philistines.
Hmm.
And then he picks up the story of the ark after those events. Whereas, like I said before, the author of Samuel just gives you one cohesive narrative. Like there's no break in any of the events. And this is where the story really takes two different paths in the different books. Samuel gives that very stripped down version. He only gives us 3 verses about the final journey into Jerusalem. The chronicler gives us 24, and the book of Samuel gives us a total of 23 verses from start to finish of the story.
Sure.
And the chronicler gives us 24 verses in comparison to the 3 final verses of Samuel. And he's going to be outlining the people and the roles that they played on the journey. So if you want to look this up, the story is in First Chronicles 15, and David has built a house for himself. He's also pitched a tent for the ark to be housed in when it arrives in Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And he explains to the people only the Levites can carry the ark. And he gives list of the Levites, their names, their families, their clans, and he also gives a command for the Levites to sanctify themselves.
Right.
So he says in First Chronicles 15:13, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke forth upon us, because we did not carry it in the way that is ordained. So David understands what went wrong. He knows what he needs to correct this
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
and he takes the proper steps to make it what
Yeah.
it should be. So
The moral of the story, check the manual.
right? And
Right?
do what you were told to do.
I'm sorry.
So, yeah.
Kidding.
Well, the Levites do what they're told. And in verse 15, it says, "And the Levites carried the ark of God upon their shoulders with poles, as Moses commanded, according to the word of the Lord." Now, this is significant because we mentioned it previously that there's an argument that the Torah was lost at this point in time and that Israel didn't have access to it. And some people say that they had access to none of it. Some people claim it was just Deuteronomy.
That's what I've always heard, is that just the book of Deuteronomy was lost.
Yeah, there's a little debate on how much is known and how much isn't known.
And there's also a theory that Deuteronomy was written after the fact and claimed to be part of the Torah. So
yeah, well, there's also another theory that Leviticus was written after the fact and claimed to be, which is, yeah. So there's all sorts of debate, but what I think this shows us that the law of Moses and the word of the Lord were definitely known at this point in time, because how else did David know that this is what Moses had commanded them to do? And even if the written words were lost, the oral tradition would have been alive and well, because in this time, like we've discussed before, having the written word was something that was reserved for just the elites. And it was something that was a very small fraction of the community would have had access to. But the oral tradition, where you taught your children, like it commands in Deuteronomy, and you explain these laws and you ingrained them into their way of thinking over and over again, then now there's no way it can be lost as long as the people are observing those commands. So David knows what Moses had to say about transporting the ark. That's the big deal. Now, David appoints musicians and he tells them which instruments that they should play. We're given a list of names. These are for sounds of joy. That's verse 16. Now, verse 22, I thought this was an interesting verse. It says, Cananiah, the leader of the Levites in music, should direct the music because he understood it. Now, I know we could probably do like a whole episode.
Oh man, yeah, I could probably talk for a couple hours about what that could mean. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think there's a principle here that the music leader should understand music.
You don't say.
I mean, I have been in some churches, okay, where the music leader did not understand music, and he did not have any friends who loved him enough to tell him that he did not understand music.
Yeah, no, and that's really that's one of my hobby horses, is talking to people, or whenever I hear people talk about, this whole bit about God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. Yeah, but you got to work with him,
right?
But the thing is, that's not always true, because granted, you could say it's retroactively that, he led them through this process in their life to get the qualifications to do the thing he wanted them to do. Sure, let's go with that. We can do that. But you also have to look at when he talks about Bezalel, he says, I've called him because I've put a spirit of understanding in him. Why?
Wisdom, knowledge, and understanding.
Because he understands and is skillful with the things that God wants him to do. So again, we could spend hours on that. I don't want to. Let's work on this text.
Okay. But yeah, but this idea that he is appointed for this role because he does understand, and David was smart enough to recognize that he understood, and this is why David chose him. And yeah, he didn't say, "Oh, he's such a nice guy, and he just loves the Lord with all his heart." I almost feel like I'm trying to get you wound up.
Yeah. Well, it's like, yeah, because I do know, there are some churches where the leadership doesn't recognize that, and that's part of knowing your team is being part of a leader.
Right.
Being part of being a good leader, I should say.
Well, and that's exactly what David is. He's demonstrating that skill. Now, I do find it interesting. The word for music here is mashal. And it's an interesting choice because it means to lift or to carry a burden. And so this is part of the description of a song leader. It can also mean utterance, or more specifically, a prophetic utterance. And the rabbis say that David chose Cananiah because he wasn't just a music leader, but he was a prophetic voice who was supposed to inspire the other prophetic voices that surrounded him. And I thought that was really interesting. Art Scroll translates this verse as the Levites lifted their voice as they would lift the souls of all those around as well. And so there's this overlap between the musicians and the prophetic. And if you've read my master's thesis, you'll find
I mean,
that
yeah, because who hasn't?
yeah, who hasn't? If you're in the paddle store, you can read it. It's one of our files. But there's this teaching within ancient cultures that artists, and that's visual artists, that's musical artists, that's people who write. Um, the artist and the prophet inhabit the same role. And so it's this idea of creation and the idea of presenting new possibilities. But there's also this overlap between musicians and gatekeepers, because if you go through these lists and chronicles, which we're not going to do because I'm not going to try to stumble over that many names, but the idea, the musicians were the gatekeepers.
Right.
And so the idea that they would fulfill a prophetic function and a musical function and a protective function all at once. And I have to wonder, how would this impact the way we view church musicians today if we took these principles and applied them to the musicians we have in our congregation or leading congregation in worship? Because there's no way that these guys were just the warm-up band for the preacher. They actually had something significant that they were doing, and they were bringing and allowing the people who deserve to be in God's presence into God's presence.
Well, and the problem is that there's a balance there, because I've been in churches where they overemphasize that idea that the worship leader is this, mystical person who
right.
changes the atmosphere. I like my nitrogen oxygen mix pretty much as it is. But anyway,
No, well, you said that, and I just watched Surviving Death, I believe. It's on Netflix, and it's about different ideas of what happens after we die, and they had this medium on there, and before they would contact the dead, they would raise the frequency, and they were literally, I kid you not, singing the song "The Rose." And so, there is this idea that's still being practiced, but it's also very ancient, that music does change the energy level.
well, I mean, science.
Hmm.
I mean, scientifically, music change. Like, if you're in tune with a song, it regulates your thought and your
Your brains
biorhythms
fire together.
So
I mean,
yeah,
and it's nuts how God has used this to unite His people. And so, yeah, there is a balance. I think we either err on one side or the other. We're elevating the music leader too highly, or we're being way too casual. And I think both are foolish. But anyhow, in verse 19, we're back in 2 Samuel chapter 6. In verse 19, the stories come back together with Chronicles and Samuel. And Samuel writes, and it was told to King David, the Lord has blessed Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Now, David has figured out not everyone who comes in contact with the ark is going to die. So he goes to get it. And
after figuring out that not everyone who comes in contact with it's going to be blessed.
Yeah, well, and it's that tension again.
Mhm.
And I love the fact that throughout these stories, we're being shown that tension, and you've got to walk with balance and discernment. And we're not told why it's different if we just read Samuel. We really need those accounts of Chronicles to fill in why it is different. The only clue we have really in Samuel is that we've gone from merrymaking and celebrating to now David is rejoicing. And, before there was that frivolous kind of idea to it.
yeah.
And now we have more of, it's still joyful. I mean, the word is rejoice, but it appreciates what a sacred event this was. And verse 13, and when those who bore the ark, still in 2 Samuel, said, when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. So that detail, as far as the 6 steps, is not recorded in Chronicles, and the book of Samuel does not give us any explanation for why 6 steps. The rabbi said it's because Uzzah died after he had taken 6 steps from the ark. And so
You can't prove that from the
you
text.
can't prove it from the text. Gematria would bring in the idea that 6 is the number of humanity.
Mhm.
And so God is now allowing humans to move the ark. So David is celebrating that. Um, I think basically it's we got it this far, there might be a snowball's chance that we can get it the rest of the
Sure,
way.
sure.
I mean, so we're like I said, we're not given that detail. Now, Chronicles does differ in the number. They say that David offered 7 bulls and 7 rams. There's no way to resolve the difference in the numbers. You could talk about, well, maybe there are different sacrifices one at the beginning of the journey, one's at the end of the journey.
That was the only thing I could think of.
Yeah. Whatever. David offered a sacrifice. That's the point. He's so joyful. He gives in his joy. So, verse 16. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. Now, Chronicles tells us that David was wearing a fine linen robe and an ephod. And we've been introduced to these linen robes and the ephod before. This was the gift that Hannah brought to young Samuel each year. This was the standard dress of the priest. And it's as such, it's a very important piece of clothing. It's a significant piece of clothing. And we shouldn't be surprised that the writer of Samuel doesn't mention the robe because it's not important. It's the ephod that's important. But both books still manage to tell us that central tenet, the thing that's most important. David had cast aside his royal robes in order to dance before the ark. So basically, he has become one of the priests in this moment. So he's not a king. The significance for him is not in being a king. It's the fact that he can function as a priest, and we're going to get into David functioning as a priest, and there's some fun stuff there. So this also conveys humility before the Lord. He doesn't have to be decked out in his finery to worship God. He can just be kind of the stripped down version of himself, and it's an act of pure joy in front of God.
And this might be a bit of an overreach, but we see, them dressing in sackcloth when they're mourning,
Mhm.
and now we see David casting off the royalty and rejoicing, and there's kind of this element of equality
Mhm.
during those times
Mhm.
that everyone's should be the same.
Yes.
And we should all be able to rejoice in the Lord, regardless of our status. We should all
Mhm.
be able to mourn with our friends who mourn, regardless of our status.
Mhm.
And I don't know if that's necessarily the point or a point, but that's something that I'm looking at. I'm going, okay, yeah,
There
when we truly are rejoicing in the Lord, it's not about status. When we're truly mourning with one another, it's not about status.
I think there really is something to that. And and Paul talks about, being all things to all people, and all that, and rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn. And if you look at the book of Samuel and you look at the clothing in Samuel could be its own character.
Mm-hmm.
And we keep having it brought up. Why? Because this is the symbol of what's going on within someone. It's like when Jonathan gave David his clothing, he's recognizing David's going to be the next king.
Right.
And Jonathan voluntarily sets that aside. Saul, we see him stripped down naked, laying out prophesying. Why? Because when he's before God, he's not the king.
Right.
God,
Right.
so you have these uh, wonderfully full images in Samuel about how clothing conveys a bigger message. And I would love, and I've said this for years, I would love for someone to actually write a book looking at the use of clothing within Samuel. And I just don't have the time to do it because I have a feeling that there's a lot of stuff that I've missed, and I need somebody who's more insightful to pick that up and run with it. But I know there's something there. So But yeah, David, he set aside his royal status, and now he's dancing. And after the death of Uzzah, David had to confront the truth that moving God to Jerusalem was not his right as a king. It could only be accomplished if God allowed it. So to
hmm
see this as God granting him favor, as God extending grace, this is what leads him to be joyful and to want to celebrate in front of God. It's not that David managed to get the ark to Jerusalem. Remember the question he asked, how will the ark come to me? Not how will I bring it here? But he
hmm
he changed it. Now David's realizing he is still dependent on God to accomplish these things.
Right.
So verse 15, and David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Now Chronicles basically tracks here. Now, Kenaniah is mentioned by name, and there's a fuller list of instruments because Chronicles, you got to remember how grand the nation is.
hmm
But it does conclude with the shofar or the horn. And when we know what we know about Samuel as the writer of Samuel, and we know this because we've gone from the beginning of the book to this point, we know that one of the things he does is he strips everything back and he only gives you the details he thinks are important when they're important. So he has established a pattern that we as readers need to respect.
Right.
And you wouldn't get that if you hadn't read the book from beginning to this point. And so since he's decided to include this detail of the shofar to keep it when he cast aside all the other instruments, they didn't have any meaning for him. We have to ask, why is the shofar important? Why is this the detail he chooses to retain at this point? Now, the writer doesn't clarify. He gives us absolutely no explanation. But Professor Carl van der Toorn of the University of Amsterdam gives us an interesting explanation. And so he sees this connection of the events of 2 Samuel 6 as part of a common ancient Near Eastern ceremony.
Okay.
And we know that this was probably around grape season, and it was a time for, well, I'm sorry. We don't know that it was around grape season. We're going to talk about these ceremonies. We know these ceremonies often took place around grape season.
Okay.
And it was very significant that this was the time that they took place because, you're getting your crops in, you're getting your grapes in, you're able to make the batch of wine for the next year. So yes, you're going to celebrate God because
Yeah, well, it would make sense in the storyline for them to want to bring the ark during this season because if David's the
Mhm.
king might want to, sacrifice before the ark.
Mhm.
So,
Yes. Well, and so if we look at the Ugaritic calendar, we find a cycle of holidays that's very similar to the Jewish calendar. And at this time of
you know what that is? That's proof that the Bible ripped people off. Or maybe
uh,
they lived in the same part of the world
yeah,
where the
right.
seasons were similar.
You know?
Sorry.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about this when I wrote this up. It's like this is not to shake people's faith and to go, "Oh, the Bible's just plagiarized." And no, there's some very specific distinctions. We're going to talk about those too. But the similarities are that the celebration would last for a month, and this has happened around roughly the Jewish calendar month of Elul, and ends with the new year.
hmm
And so this is Rosh Hashanah on the Jewish calendar. In both calendars, the height of the celebration was on the 15th. It lasted for 7 days. It would include a temple sacrifice, the temple, very many, lots of different temple-based rituals. And the king was the central player in these rituals.
hmm
So in First Kings, when we get there in chapter 8, we're going to learn that Solomon considers this the appropriate time of the year, the most auspicious time of the year, to consecrate the new temple that he's just built.
Makes sense.
Okay, so under Jeroboam's reign, the celebration is going to continue and it's going to be one of the most significant for his kingdom. And in Israel, this was a time where you actively remembered God was king over Israel.
Sure.
And so that you celebrated it at this time. Now, we have similar rituals. They're going to occur in Babylon, the Akitu festival.
Well, and actually,
Mhm.
I just want to put this out there. If this is the time to remember that God is king of Israel, it would make sense for David to lose his royal robes.
That's a good point. I hadn't brought that up. But yeah, that's really good. So in the Babylon Akitu festival, this was at the New Year, and the image of Marduk was paraded around the city on a throne. And where is God enthroned?
On the ark.
Yep. In the Ugaritic ceremonies, this was to commemorate Baal's victory over Yamu and Mot, and he was hailed specifically as being king.
hmm
Uh, when the Babylonians celebrated with Marduk, the king was said to actually take Marduk by the hand and lead him back into the temple complex with the blast of trumpets.
Hmm.
And so the theme of kingship was very much a part of all of these ceremonies. And Zamara, he notes that there's similarities not only with the Ugaritic and the Babylonian. He also notes that there's Assyrian and Egyptian rituals that also follow these same kind of patterns. And so the shared language of ritual between all of these cultures would have been known to Israel, and it's not uncommon for God to co-opt a known symbol of the day and reinterpret it to convey his message.
hmm hmm
And we definitely know this. We see where there are different poems and things in the Psalms where have been rewritten to present God as greater than these other gods using the exact same words. So the exact same words used by other cultures. So to have the ark paraded into the city, led by the king, blessed by as he's dressed as the priest, and it's amid the blast of the shofar, we have this unmistakable message that everybody in the country would have understood. They're
hmm
bringing in the God who is the king into the city. There's no denying this. Everyone got this because this was the language and pictures of the day used to convey this message.
hmm
And so God is coming into Jerusalem to claim his throne. And I would bet my husband's dog that this happened at Rosh Hashanah.
You'd bet your husband's dog on a lot less.
This is true. So, I mean, anybody want a Chewini? So anyway, I don't have any evidence that this happened at Rosh Hashanah, but I just have this idea. And, but the thing is, every time God co-opts a symbol for his use, he doesn't just recreate it. He doesn't just rip it off. He actually reinterprets it.
hmm
So this is
He
not,
corrects it. He and redeems it.
yeah, yeah.
Imagine.
And this isn't, the Christian cover band switching out Baby and Dear for Jesus. This is an actual reinterpretation of the events. And so, the idea here is that he is conveying that he's greater than all these other gods. Okay, first of all, the other gods were moved by their priest. God has already demonstrated he's not moved by humanity. Humanity has to allow him to
Yeah.
move. They can invite him.
Not going where he's not going anywhere unless he wants to.
Exactly. So this is one huge point. So the priests don't just decide, hey, let's take God out for a walk. God tells the priest, hey, it's time to move.
hmm
He was, like I said, he wasn't taken by the priest and he wasn't taken by the king. So the king did not take him by the hand. The king actually had to maintain a respectful distance.
hmm
David did not carry the ark.
Right.
He wasn't led out of his temple and then brought right back to his temple. So he wasn't taken from one place to return to the same place. He's actually going into new territory
hmm
and is going to be manifest there. God doesn't need to be re-enthroned every year. That's the purpose of these other ceremonies.
Right.
We're gonna make sure he's on their good,
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not a sun god. He's not a weather god.
He
he
doesn't
doesn't.
change.
Yeah. He's not one of those seasonal gods.
Exactly. And so the purposes of when Israel celebrates this, it isn't to re-enthrone God. And even as they continued these annual celebrations of God being king, the idea was you're supposed to remember God never stopped being king.
Mm-hmm.
There was never a threat to his throne through the passage of time. The year didn't wear him out and he
The
needs to be
days getting
supercharged.
shorter.
Yeah. Yeah. God is always in control. So it's wholly appropriate that when you bring the God King into this new capital city, that you would blow the shofar because you're announcing the king is arriving.
Mm-hmm.
And David has cast off his robes. He's saying, I'm not the king.
Mm-hmm.
Here's your king. And so we have to remember that this whole point of this book is to teach us that, or this episode, David doesn't get to do what David wants to do because he's David. David has to be in submission to God. And so I think that the writer of Samuel was very intentional in retaining that element of the shofar,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what makes people look at these other celebrations to make that connection. And so, the human king might be necessary so that God's wisdom and words and decrees can be dispensed among the people of the
Mm-hmm.
nation. But the king is only as good as he is devoted to God.
Right.
So, verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window, saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So this verse here is a bit of foreshadowing. We get this little glimpse of Michal. She sees what's happening. She's not happy.
And this is where, to me, I see David as Andy Dwyer now, from Parks and Rec. Chris Pratt is hilarious.
Yeah, and we're kind of this little verse here, because we aren't going to deal with Michal here really that much, because this verse kind of gives us a little foreshadowing of what's going to happen, but immediately the author shifts us right back to what's going on with David.
Mm.
We just need to know that she saw it. She's aware of what's going on, but we don't need to spend too much time with her, even in the text, because the important part's going to come up later. So, verse 17, and they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt and peace offerings before the Lord. Verse 18, and when David had finished offering the burnt and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, that great title that we find so often in Samuel. Verse 19, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and cakes of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. So what's really interesting and also very problematic about these verses is it seems like David is doing all of this, that there's no priest doing it on his behalf being mentioned.
Right.
It sounds like he is functioning as a priest. And the problem is, we already know that Saul, this is one of the things he got in trouble for.
Right.
So even everybody, there's a lot of arguments being made that, well, we just don't have the whole story. The idea of doing it on behalf of the king is the same as the king doing it. But, even in Chronicles, where we have these lengthy list of Levites and priests, and we're given their names and we have their duties outlined, there's still nothing that changes. David's still presented as the one doing it. And so there's been a lot of attempts to kind of solve this issue. And like I said, one of them is, well, David commanded it and it's being done on his behalf. Okay, possibly. But the problem with that solution is we are assuming things that aren't in the text.
Mm.
The problem with that is almost any solution we come up with, we're going to have to assume something that's not in the text.
Yeah,
so I want to be clear on that. So, the first rule is Scripture interprets Scripture. So that's
Mhm.
what we have to go and look for, is there is another Scripture that explains this, so that if we do import something or impose something on this text, we're imposing other Scripture, not just our own ideas.
Right.
So in Psalms 110, which is a Davidic psalm, it's a messianic psalm, it's a prophetic psalm. we find we have a possible solution. And the problem is, a lot of times when we've read Psalms 110, Christians love the psalm because they do see it as prophetic. And so
Mhm.
they tend to read it as applying strictly to Jesus. And they forget that when David was writing it, David was the Messiah, he was the anointed one. And David is very much presenting himself and how he sees God as viewing him within this. And so David specifically declares in Psalm 110 that he is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So, if we took time to read through the entire psalm, we're going to find that the psalm itself is about this convergence of kingship and priesthood and the supremacy of the king in Zion based on God's favor and honor. So, I did not do a full breakdown, but I just want to hit some high points. So, if we look at what's going on with David here in Samuel, and we look back at Melchizedek, we can find three uniting elements. One is both David and Melchizedek blessed people. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, David blesses the nation of Israel. Both feed people. David just provided this great feast for everyone. Melchizedek feeds Abraham. And then, of course, they're both priests, both wearing the linen ephod of the priest. It's not specifically stated that Melchizedek was dressed as a priest, but there is this presumption within the text. Well, it states that he's a priest. So there's this presumption that he would have the signs of being a priest evident because Abraham somehow knew that he's a priest. And so, of course, we have the question, why could David as a king function as a priest when Saul couldn't? And I think the answer might actually be in location and in accomplishment because David did something Saul never did. David conquered Jerusalem.
Right.
And so, as the conqueror of Jerusalem, David has the rights to assume the roles of any of the city's previous rulers.
Okay.
This is
One being Melchizedek.
exactly. And so that Genesis 14, we're told Melchizedek, he's the king of Salem. He's also the priest of the Most High. And so, as the new ruling king of Jerusalem or Salem, David has every right to step into that role
Hmm.
as the priest and the king. And we got to remember in all the Canaanite religions, the priest was not the primary mediator between gods and men.
Right.
It was the king.
Mhm.
And so when David steps into this role, he's actually looking back to a tradition that predates the Sinai covenant. So in Psalms 110, David is actually writing and he's realigning the expectations of king and priest to reunite them in Jerusalem. And it's from the city that God's going to rule. And it's this place that God is going to execute judgment on the nation. Jerusalem is presented as the only legitimate place where this kind of power can be exercised. So, verse 2, the Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Saul, again, never conquered Jerusalem. He doesn't have this right because he is not in the right place. And this is despite the fact Saul had every reason to try to conquer Jerusalem
Right.
because half of it belonged to his tribe, just like half of it belonged to David's tribe. But Saul never acquired any new lands. But that's the other thing you got to
Mhm,
remember.
mhm.
He never drove out the people who lived in Israel that weren't supposed to be there. And the conquest for Israel, really as a nation as a whole, really stopped back in Judges 2 when the angel of the Lord departed from them because the people weren't doing what they were supposed to do. A king was supposed to reignite that command, that mandate that they conquer all of Canaan. And Saul, he failed generally in Israel and specifically with Jerusalem. And now David begins his role and his reign as king by conquering the Jerusalem. I mean, he has worked towards the fulfillment not just of what God has commanded them when they entered Canaan. He's actually pulling on that time of Abraham and
In the older covenant.
exactly. And so when he establishes his kingdom, his capital city, where the priesthood and the kingdom has been, the priesthood and the kingship has been united, he proves that he's able to do this by bringing the ark into the city. So he's reclaiming and reinstituting a tradition that has dated as far back as we can possibly remember.
Mhm.
And so we also find that this is a lasting legacy. In 2 Samuel 8:18, we discover that David's sons are also priests, which David's sons should not be priests because we know for a fact they're not Levites.
Right.
And so it's at this point that the chronicler takes a break from the Samuel narrative and gives us another list of Levites who were serving. And so when you look at Chronicles and how the focus is on the Levites and their duties and how David is installing them, who is he? I think we forget that the king has no right to explain to the Levites how to serve.
Right.
Unless we do have these combined roles. And so only whenever David reunites the two roles do we have this throwback to Abraham's reign. And we're going to talk about how this is even further strengthened by the song David's going to sing in First Chronicles. And so it's really interesting how subtle it is, but once you see it, it's everywhere.
It's obvious, yeah.
So
that's like a lot of things in the Bible. Like once you see it, you're like, oh my goodness. And that's the thing I've really enjoyed about doing this, and also listening to a lot of other scholars through different podcasts and things, as I really am seeing that I have really interpreted the Bible through a lot of tradition. And there's a lot of things that I have assumed upon the text, and I love going back to it. Just what does the Bible actually say? What does it literally say there? And there's many times where, and I can't think of any specific off the top of my head, but I know there have been many times we've gone through a passage and I've gone, oh wow, that doesn't say anything close to what I was told it meant.
right.
And it's like, how did we even get there from here?
Well,
So,
and I think, and I really, for me, what kind of drove it home too was whenever, I'm reading through this, and the only reason why I stopped to think, why is the shofar mentioned? Was because I knew how the writer of Samuel operated. And if I hadn't already had that pattern established in my mind, it probably wouldn't have stood out to me.
Right.
And so it really is a matter of practice and getting familiar with the text.
Yep.
And that's something that only happens with time and discipline. And I'm not saying I'm great at it, but I mean, one of the things I love about this podcast is it gives me a great excuse to do what I love to do anyway. So, I hope that everybody who's listening is getting inspired to go, okay, what can I see?
Yeah.
Where can I take this? And
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good high point to end on. So we will be back next week. If you enjoyed hanging out with us, be part of the conversation. Raven Creek SC on all the social media. RavenCreekSC.com is the website where you can find this show and others, and more to come in the future. Hopefully we'll be getting that together soon.
yeah, surprise.
Surprise. But in the meantime, just hit us up. Let us know what you think, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.